To go more into Holden's psychology, another quote is, "Can you imagine how drunk I was?" Salinger, page 167. I believe that drunk actions are actually sober thoughts, and Holden is actually reaching out to the only people who are still available just because he is lonely. He is subconsciously doing it, but he just needs someone to talk to. Holden continues to drown himself in alcohol as now he has no one, he is left with no one, and even tries to call Sally again, but she refuses to talk to him knowing that he's drunk. He almost called Jane but decided against it, and she is still what he sees as his only option and still wants to be with her because he's still afraid of being alone and he doesn't know what else to do. Another trick Holden uses is the gunshot wound, where he pretends that he was shot in the stomach. I believe Holden does this just to make himself feel less weak, and even though he tries to use these thoughts to distract himself from pain that he's truly feeling, to make himself feel stronger when he's in a vulnerable position, because he knows that he's vulnerable and he doesn't like to feel that way or admit how he's feeling about anything, so he converts it into something a little bit easier to understand for himself. And again, he also avoids himself by, instead of saying I when he's talking about his feelings, he says you, because that even shows that after the book is quote-unquote resolved, that he still has these feelings and hasn't entirely worked them out, which is exactly why the ending is so unsatisfying. However, the ending being so unsatisfying is definitely within characterization for Holden, because his entire character arc has been entirely unsatisfying, as it hasn't even seemed like he's completely learned anything, and that we've just been on one big digression almost the entire book. And while for a split moment at the end of the book he decides to help Phoebe and mature for a minute and help her to the ring and really step up as a big brother, it doesn't exactly show that he's had any character development, because once again at the very end of the book he goes right back and talks about how he was ill and kind of skips over the entire story and just ends it off with a little bit of vagueness. Another huge topic with Holden is definitely sex, and how one of the things is he says all the time he doesn't understand sex itself, and which kind of represents his inability to communicate with anyone, whether it be physically or even emotionally. Another metaphor for Holden not being able to properly connect with people or communicate with them is the red hat. He always puts on the red hat when he is anxious or stressed, and in those scenarios is when he least communicates with people and he turns to profanity instead of actually trying to talk to anyone. The red hat, being a very bold color, shows that it doesn't blend in with the rest of society, and Holden often says that no one can truly understand him, just like when he shows Ackley the hat for the first time and he says that he was ripped off because even he got that hat for a very cheap price, but Ackley thinks that it's a waste, showing that no one can truly understand him and the things he wants for himself. Building off of that, Mr. Antolini also kind of calls him out on it. Basically says that if he doesn't get his act together and start realizing that it's not just Holden's bubble and that there's another world waiting for him, that his whole life is going to be much harder than it actually has to be, because he can't properly communicate with people, which makes his life 100 times harder for him. And as Holden gets older and progresses on later in life, it's going to be very hard for him to connect with others if he can't live outside of his own personal bubble. Another topic that's really interesting about Holden is his obsession with innocence. Throughout the entire book, that's been one of his main defining qualities. One example is with the white car and the snowball, and Holden almost threw the white snowball at the car, but then decided against it as the white car looked too nice to throw a snowball at. The white car represents innocence. Another example is when Holden was extremely worried that Stradlater and Jane had their way together in his car, and he was so angry about this because he wanted Jane to stay innocent. And I believe that Holden is so fixated on innocence because he lost his own as a kid when he lost Allie. It would make sense why he's so protective of Jane and his sister and everything around him that represents purity, as he wants to keep the thing that was stolen from him. It even makes the end of the book make sense, his decision to actually be somewhat mature for Phoebe, because she is a symbol of purity as well, as she is his sister, and he doesn't want any harm to come to her, and it didn't matter what happened to him as long as she was safe, because he wanted to protect her from harm. When Holden finds the lagoon, he is obviously in a dark state of mind, as he continues to think about thoughts of death and funerals, and even his own funeral for that matter. Holden would also rather die young than become a materialist like his parents or any other adult that he knows, because he would rather preserve his innocence as somebody young than become the people that he hates the most, adults. Holden also makes the claim that he hates funerals because he thinks of Allie and how when it rains he can't duck for cover like everyone else can above ground. He hates that he has no control over the situation. There's nothing else he can do, which may represent Holden's life in the present, where he feels he has no control over what's going on in his life and everything is falling apart. Another severe issue with Holden is his ability to lie, and he even tells himself that he is the most terrific liar, and he prides himself on the fact. Holden comes up with so many lies, and I believe that it is to distract himself from what he believes is a boring life. He also lies possibly to avoid questions that he believes to be too personal. Holden is also afraid of people knowing who he really is, and in fact, I don't even think Holden really knows who he exactly is, and being bored of his personality, he tries to spruce it up and make it seem more interesting. Now, without being diagnosed, this is probably an obvious case of what seems to be bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder itself is something that causes mood swings, loss of energy, as well as an inability to just do everyday tasks. Throughout this book, both mentally and physically, he is exhausted from his trip and even from the people he interacts with. From his fight with Stradlater to walking around New York and going to several bars, he's absolutely exhausted.